All right, well, Manso, Clay, Ferraro, happy to be back for the next round for both Miami Heat and the Florida Panthers. We got some winners in this town, Clay, and we will break down what's coming up this week. We thought 2 weeks ago was the craziest week of our lives, right? I think, again, it's going to be this week, too, again.
Yeah.
Except no F1. We don't have to worry about F1. That's in the past. But we do have to
for
worry
good
about
reasons, though, right? This is what we live all year for. This is fun.
Yeah, this is really what it's all about. So let's get into it. On this Miami Sports Pod, we're going to talk about both teams. And obviously, the Heat now in the Eastern Conference Finals, second time in 3 seasons, will face the Boston Celtics. The Panthers, meanwhile, facing Tampa again, but this time after winning their first playoff series since the year of the Rat in 1996. So, Clay, we'll get into all that, but let's start with the Miami Heat. I think that's where the focus probably is initially, given that they are facing Boston. They take care of Philadelphia, and I think what they did against Philly was really show why home court matters, and they've shown that throughout these playoffs, and it's important when we talk about this Boston series. But B is the depth we've talked about all year. I think there have been people from the outside that thought, well, that depth in the playoffs will help you because you shorten your rotation. It's all about superstars. Well, guess what? Gabe Vincent, Max Strus, all these guys in particular nights, different nights. Obviously, Jimmy Butler is a star. They're the reason you're winning these games, and that depth matters very much so far in the playoffs for Miami.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen is the reason why the depth matters so much is it's not going to be the same few guys every single night. And so while the number of players that you play may stay relatively similar from one game to the next, from one series to the next, matchups matter a lot. And, there is this feeling that, okay, as series go on, you get to start to figure out the other team a little bit. But that doesn't mean that a Max Strus can't go out there and score 17 points in the first half of a closeout game and in many ways be the third best player on the floor for the Miami Heat, the third best all-around player in these playoffs. And so when you have players who can come in and give you what a Victor Oladipo has given you, the types of minutes, Gabe Vincent can come in and start for a Kyle Lowry when he's got this hamstring injury. And really what we've seen, Will, is that the Heat are a better team with Gabe Vincent at 100% than they are whatever percentage Kyle Lowry's been at in the two games that he tried to play. And that gets back to the depth that, in any given game, you're only going to play a certain number of players. And a lot of those guys who contributed all year aren't going to play, but a lot of them are going to play at some point. And each game and each series is going to take on its own entity. And I think we've seen that as this has gone on.
Well, what I love that Spo was able to do against the Sixers, and I think it'll be important against Boston, though it'll be different guys' matchups. As for instance, he was able to insert a Caleb Martin to get very important minutes. And when you look at Caleb's stat line, it wasn't impressive, but Caleb's help and his defense and his energy and the link that he has in athleticism was huge. Even Duncan, the little run that he got, while everybody was clamoring for Duncan to go out there and have a big game, that never happened. It was Max Strus who had him. But when Duncan was out there, again, it goes to the point where I think he spaces. I think he helps in the attention he draws from other teams. Victor Oladipo, who you see there, you mentioned Gabe. All these guys at particular moments had to make big plays, had to be a big reason why. And that goes without Tyler Hero really having that explosion. He had early in the series a big game. He had 25 in game 1. But as the series went on, he kind of faded a bit. And part of it was not necessarily Tyler's doing. It was the Sixers really paying a lot of attention to Tyler Hero, which allowed then Jimmy Butler, I think, which shockingly to me, the Sixers never decided to double Jimmy. Now, I think the one thing you and I will agree with as we look at this particular matchup against Boston is that the Celtics will not allow Jimmy Butler to just beat them. It's just not going to happen. The Celtics defense, quite frankly, one of the best in the league. Certainly in the second half of the season they were. You look at Miami year-round, they were one of the best. But when you look at Jimmy Butler right now, everybody's going to talk about Jayson Tatum and the show he put on in some of those games in against Milwaukee. But is Jimmy Butler the best player in this series? And does Boston have to double-team Jimmy and let someone else beat them?
He's not the best offensive player in the series. I think when you factor in defense and feel for the game, he is the best player, all-around player in the series. And that's completely giving flowers to Jayson Tatum and what he's done. He's turned into the superstar that I think everybody was kind of waiting for. And, with Tatum, it's always been about, okay, we've seen you do it in spurts. We've especially seen you do it in the regular season. Well, now we've seen him do it in the playoffs. And Will, it's not just scoring with Tatum, by the way. He's also become a fantastic passer, great feel for the game.
He's very good facilitator.
Yeah, I still think Jimmy Butler is at a different level defensively, and there's an intensity level there. But look, man, it's 1-1A, and it's super close. To your point about the Celtics not letting Jimmy beat them single-handedly, the interesting thing with the Celtics and what they do is they're going to do a lot of switching. There's a lot of similarities to what the Heat do defensively, to where, what the 76ers did in their series was they basically said, we are going to allow Jimmy Butler to score. We don't think he can score enough to beat us, but we're not going to allow him.
Oh, they got that wrong. Jeez.
And that's the thing, is they never adjusted. When Jimmy Butler proved over and over again that he was going to score enough to get it done. And by the time they figured it out, Max Strus was going off in Game 6 and it was over. So I think what the Celtics are going to do, obviously they're going to have little wrinkles here and there, but the Celtics trust all of their defenders. They're going to be very similar to the Heat, and they're going to switch a lot, and they're going to try to take away your space. And so Jimmy, I think the opportunities will be there. It won't be to the same level it was in Philadelphia, but Will, you're going to have moments in this series where Jimmy Butler is going to have to take over like he did many times in that Philadelphia series. Maybe not quite as much, and maybe not the same way, but they're going to need the Jimmy Butler that they've seen. And to your point, your question about who's the best player in the series, if Jayson Tatum turns out to be the best all-around player in this series, it's going to be a lot harder for Miami to end up winning.
Well, I think the answer is Jimmy Butler, but I agree with you offensively what Jayson Tatum has become. And again, as a facilitator, he's been much better. He was certainly good in that Milwaukee series, distributing the basketball when he got a lot of attention. But Jimmy always makes the right basketball play, almost sometimes to a fault, right? And Jimmy also recognizes when he has to try to take over a game, which he did a couple of times in the series against Philadelphia. One of them came in a loss where Jimmy had to go out there and score 40. No one else could pick up the slack. I think against Boston, Jimmy understands he's got to have those moments. Sure, he's going to have moments like that where, hey, I've got to make these plays. I got to take over a game, but it has to be more so in moments of time as opposed to a whole game. I still think when Jimmy enters a game, Jimmy will tell you, I think I'd rather score 21 and all my guys get a balance of scoring and play to their game than me score 40 and have to find a way to get those guys to do something. It's just not in his DNA to be that kind of player. And when you couple it with his defense and what he's doing, Jimmy, there is a playoff Jimmy. Last year he caught a lot of flack for the whole stupidly locked in comment, and everybody thought, well, stupidly locked in and they got swept and he wasn't good. He wasn't. Neither was the team. But I think what you saw 2 years ago in the bubble, what you've seen so far in these playoffs, you've seen what playoff Jimmy is about. That whole cliche, that whole saying playoff Jimmy, it is a different level. He is a different player. With Jayson Tatum, no doubt, the Heat are going to have to focus their attention the same way they did with Trae Young, the same way they did in stretches of the series, Will Embiid or Harden kind of switching off, saying, hey, I'm not going to let this guy beat me. I'm not going to let this guy get, go out and get 45, 50 points, which those guys are very capable of. That's not Jimmy's game. That's Jayson Tatum's game. I think that'll be interesting to see. But I think what Jimmy will likely want, and Clay, you referenced him earlier, and I think it's a good time to talk about him now, is that Max Strus has reached a level now where he struggled in those two, as the Heat did in the two road games in Phillies 3 and 4. Everybody did. And there was the question I think that many people had is, man, is it a little too much for him? Is this a little too much for Max Strus, given that he doesn't have that experience in the playoffs? Now you go to the road atmosphere in Philly, for all the hatred that Heat fans have toward their fans. And trust me, I was there, and it's terrible to fans are rough there. It can get in your head, and it seemed to a lot of players. But my goodness, after he had a Game 5 at home and then the Game 6 in Philly, it's pretty clear that Max Strus is, as you said earlier, Clay, is probably the third best player and most important player on the Heat that which is crazy when you think it's Jimmy Bam, Kyle likely out at least early in the series and maybe longer. Tyler, who we'll talk more about in a bit, hasn't been that guy yet, though he will likely get those chances. Max Strus, all of a sudden, with his shooting, his penetrating, and his defense, all of a sudden looks like a completely different player.
I think the best way to put it is you haven't done it until you do it. And I think we're going to talk about that with the Florida Panthers. And you had to hear over and over again, well, they haven't won a playoff series since 1996. Well, guess what? Now they have. And so you don't have to hear about that anymore. That part of the equation is gone. And so with Max Strus, I think the old saying is that role players play better at home, whereas the stars have to take over on the road. I don't think that really applies if you're going to be a championship team. You need to have role players step up in big situations on the road. And Max Strus did it. he did it in Philadelphia. And so now when they go to Boston for games 3 and 4, it doesn't mean he's going to have a great game in either or both games. But what it means is that you can no longer say the moment is too big for him, because in the biggest moment, I mean, you're going to have, look, you may have slightly bigger moments because the series is more important, is further in the playoffs, whatever. But I mean, at some point, it's all the same. And when you step up and you play big on the road, that's in your back pocket now. You don't ever have to talk about not being able to do that again. And what I do think is interesting and somewhat ironic, Will, was I think the moment when we all realized Max Strus was different was in that game in Boston that the Heat won. It was the second game after Eric Spoelstra shook up the lineup. And, they blew out the Kings in the first game. It was their 6-game winning streak. They blew out the Kings in the first game. And we're like, it's the Kings. Now they're going to play Boston, who's on this crazy winning run. And, let's see him do it now. Well, Max Strus had some enormous defensive plays on Jayson Tatum, including a big charge that he drew late in that game. And so I think it was that moment where you kind of saw, okay, we've been thinking too much about what he does offensively and, maybe just not being as big of a negative defensively as Duncan Robinson is. But it was in that game where you realize, no, there's a different level.
There's a different level.
And nobody's going to put him on the all-defensive team anytime soon. But he is – I think it's fair to say what we've seen from him is he's a plus defender. He's not a minus defender. Fair. He's at the very least, when you put him out there with the other 4 guys, you don't feel uncomfortable if he gets switched off onto one of the other team's better players. And there are going to be moments where he's going to be matched up against Tatum, and he's shown he can hold his own.
Yeah, and I think that's the key for Miami is that they have, you enter this series wondering, okay, outside of Jimmy, who's really going to have those moments? And Max has had them where he could score in bunches. He had 20 in that game 6. Tyler is, I think, the next step to try to see that. Bam also, Bam had some big games against Boston 2 years ago in the bubble. You need to have at least 1 or 2 of those Bam games because I think you and I both agree. Bam's main focus needs to be defense. And I know that frustrates fans, but if Bam can be the all-world defender he is consistently and multiple guys and run out and chase down Tatum and now let him get loose. And if he has to switch over and help out, whether it's a big like Horford or go out and help even, on a Jaylen Brown, whatever, maybe Bam can guard 1 through 5. That is the focus, that Bam needs to be all-world defense like he always is. And by the way, he was in that Philly series. But I think that in this series, you're going to need Bam to have at least 1 or 2 big games. And when I say big games, I don't mean 18 points, 10 rebounds. I mean, Bam's going to have a 25-point night because, again, I don't think Boston's just going to go out and let Jimmy Butler one-on-one battle you and score 30, 35, 40 points like he did against the Sixers. I do think, though, that because the way Boston plays defense, there will be opportunities for Miami to shoot from distance. There will be looks, and that plays into their hands when they're hitting shots. As we saw against Philly, it doesn't play into their hands when they're not hitting shots. So when you think big picture to this series, what's the key for the Heat? Is it more so the offense and hitting those threes, or is it more so the identity of their defense, staying to what they do? Or is it truly both, and the only way they're going to beat Boston 4 times is hitting their shots consistently, their threes, their looks, and playing defense?
I think what we've seen in these playoffs so far, obviously the Atlanta series was, you kind of throw that one out because Atlanta wasn't as good, probably shouldn't have even been in the playoffs. What I think we've seen is that these series take on different iterations as they go on. So I think the key for Miami will be when you have 2 teams that are so evenly matched, like these 2 teams are, it's how do you adjust to the adjustments? Which team, when you finally get the rules of engagement, when you get to the point of the series where you can throw in another wrinkle here and there, but the sweeping adjustments that happen from game to game don't happen anymore. Have you gotten to the point where you figured out enough about the other team? I know that sounds really vague, Will, but I think specifically it's like, okay, how are you going to defend Tatum to where he is hurting you the least possible? Whether that's making him score more because you're more concerned about him as a facilitator and the other guys beating you. Or maybe it's, hey, anybody but Tatum. And by the way, that's what we saw. You mentioned it against Philadelphia. Embiid, it was tough because he was a shell of who we had seen in the regular season. But they said, we're not going to let Harden beat us. And there was the one game where he was making a bunch of step-back threes, and you tip your cap. If Tatum does that 4 games, you're going to lose. But I think if Tatum is getting shots in rhythm, there's going to be a certain point where the Heat are going to say, okay, we're going to have to give him the Trae Young treatment. We're going to have to give him the James Harden treatment. So I think that's from the defensive side. And offensively, Will, to your point, somebody has to step up other than Jimmy. And maybe that is Max Strus again. Maybe that's Bam Adebayo in a game or two. Maybe it's different guys in each game. The Tyler Hero situation is interesting to me because if you go back, and it was funny, when you listen to what he was saying at practice this morning, and we're recording this on Sunday, he said, these two teams defend very differently. There's one scheme I would rather go against, right? And so then, he didn't say which one it was, but naturally you go back and you look at how he played against the two teams during the year. He was a lot better against Milwaukee than he was against Boston. So I think he has to get over that, whatever it is schematically that he feels like Boston is going to be a tougher matchup for him. He's going to have to find a way to just go out there and get buckets because they're going to need somebody else to do it. And so I think it's if finding those other guys that are going to help Jimmy along the way, because Boston is not going to let you just get free and get wide open. You're going to need some guys that are going to go out there and get their own shots and make them. And Tyler Hero can do that better than anybody else on this roster when he's on.
Yeah, and I think that's, when I look at the keys for the Heat, I think he's going to get looks. I think he's going to get opportunities. I think against Boston, I think in Philly's case, because A, I think the Heat were better than Philly, and B, because of Joel Embiid's situation where he wasn't going to just take over and dominate and single-handedly win a game, I think you didn't need to stretch too far into the Heat roster as far as point production. You can get a lot from Jimmy and Max and Bam and kind of a little hodgepodge, a little of everybody. I think in this series, though, and again, I compared to 2 years ago when they played in the bubble and Tyler had those big moments and he kind of became this national spotlight kind of player. I think Tyler has to have a game or two of that. I already mentioned Bam, and I think Tyler as well. And that's where it does become about your stars. And while the Heat are built on balance and it's gotten them through the first 2 rounds, and I think it'll be a big part of this series too, I also think that when you're playing a team that has 2 legitimate star-type players, Tatum is definitely a star. Jaylen Brown can play like a star at times, especially in offense, and go out there and give you 30. The Heat needs someone to match that. And I'm not sure if Max Strus can really get to that level, but I'm sure that Tyler can. Like, can Max be a guy who gets you 20? We saw it against Philly. Can Max be a guy that gets you 30? We've never really seen that. We've seen it from Tyler. I think Tyler has to have one of those games at some point, because when you talk about these series, it's always about win 4, right? That's all that matters, win 4.
Right.
Doesn't matter. Everyone is different. I'm going to sound like Eric Spoelstra, but, every game takes on its own personality. So you may win one in the mud, and that's the game where Jimmy gets to the free throw line and Bam makes a big defensive play and you win that. You may win one when you're shooting threes left and right. That's the one where Max Strus is hitting threes, where maybe Duncan gets a run, where Tyler gets a run. You may get one where a player just takes over, and that could be the game where Tyler Hero does that. But the bottom line is that there isn't one formula in my mind to beat the Celtics 4 times. So for the Heat, this is where their depth is important, but they need to get that second level scoring, that next level outside of Jimmy. I don't think Jimmy can single-handedly win this series for Miami. I think it's going to take, and I know it sounds, of course he can't, no player can, but what I'm saying is I don't think they can depend every night for Jimmy has to be their leading scorer every night. Yeah. I think it has to be on a couple of those wins. If they get the 4 wins that they need, a couple of them are going to have to be a night where Tyler's that guy, or maybe Max is that guy. We'll see what happens with Kyle Lowry. So, Clay, as we sit there, let's just get to our prediction before we get to the Panthers. I'm going to say Heat in 7. I know the Heat in 5 is great. I would love to think they can. I don't think the Heat are going to win in 5. I think this is going to be a brutally tough series. I think every game will have its own personality. I think Jayson Tatum will hit some big shots. I think there's going to be at least 1 or 2 games where Heat fans are going to left scratching their heads because Boston is just going to take care of business. They're going to play their defense, hit their shots, make things tough for Miami, and it's going to be a long night for the Heat. But again, it's first to 4, and I think Miami gets to that 4. And oh, by the way, the home court advantage, pretty big deal right now. When you look back at that game you referenced, that second game of the 6-game winning streak, that's what ended up giving the Heat this opportunity to start at FTX Arena, and I think that will be significant in the series.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I know it's boring when we agree, but I think the Heat win the first game and the last game of the series, and I think the last game is going to be Game 7. I think that those two, and it's funny because the rest of the series, if it goes that way, the Celtics are gonna win 3 of the other 5 games. But I think the Heat are fortunate that they got a couple of extra days off. And look, Boston was able to kind of blow out Milwaukee in the second half of that game, but you still had extra days where you were preparing for the Milwaukee Bucks You were not just like working on yourself. You're not getting your bodies right. I mean, and that's what the Heat have been able to do. So I'm going Heat in 7. I do think the one top, you mentioned Kyle Lowry, the Robert Williams injury is another major factor here, and he was available to play in Game 7 for the Celtics. Their paint defense is a lot different with him out there, and it's not just, you talk about Bam needing to play a big game. The thing about the bubble was he's going up against Daniel Tice consistently. If Rob Williams is healthy, you're not going to see Daniel Tice.
No, not. Yeah.
No, and look, Grant Williams, Al Horford can certainly hold their own more so than Daniel Tice can, and yet I think Rob Williams, when he's healthy, makes them different. But with that said, if those two injuries kind of balance each other out as far as how effective Williams can be, how much Lowry plays, I think it's Heat in 7, and I think it's because they win Game 1 and they win Game 7, obviously.
By the way, I also think that they will lose a home game, and I think they'll win a road game in this series. I don't think this is going to be the team wins every. You know what I mean? I think they'll Philly. I think they'll lose one at home, and I think they'll win one. I think they'll win one on the road, and then eventually get back to that Game 7 with the opportunity to win. Okay, so that's the Miami Heat. We'll certainly talk more as the series goes on, because again, we expect this to be a very long series. And by the way, you can watch Games 3 and 4 on Local 10. Clay and I got you covered all week, but Games 3 and 4 will be on Local 10 for those of you that live in South Florida. Now let's get to the Florida Panthers, because you talk about the Panthers. They faced the Lightning, and you knew it was coming. Clay, first of all, congrats to the Cats. It's huge. They won a series in the playoffs for the first time since 1996. But now you got to face the Lightning. Back-to-back Stanley Cup champions, the team that knocked you out last year, the team that, quite frankly, is kind of like the little brother, and they keep beating your behind up and taking care of you. And it's the step you have to take if you really got to be that team. And the Heat were the best team in the NHL all year long. The Panthers were the best team in the NHL all year long, but we always knew that the Lightning were just kind of humming along, trying to get in that position, and that at some point it would get here. We're at that point. Have you changed your thoughts on if the Panthers are truly the better team, or do you look at this as, hey, the Lightning are the two-time Stanley Cup champs until they prove otherwise, that they're a better team and the team to beat?
No change. And, I'm not going to go strictly based on what you hear the guys say, the player, but I thought it was really interesting listening to Brandon Montour on Sunday morning. And he said, look, this is who we wanted to play. This is who a lot of guys wanted to play. We're looking forward to this. And, I think they feel like during the regular season, they were better than the Tampa Bay Lightning. And not just record-wise, but in the games that they played. Of course, you had that game late in the season where everything was already clinched. It didn't matter. But I feel like they think that I think they feel the big brother, little brother thing. But I also think they believe that it's little brother's time. They believe that little brother has now.
And that time does come, right? That time usually does come at some point.
Yes, so I think it's not that I think it's important to embrace that recent history. It's different than like embracing the 26 years of not winning a first round, because you're talking about so many different players. I mean, some of these guys probably weren't even born when that streak started. I mean, I know they weren't. So like, you don't want to like let that weigh on you. But I think when you can kind of embrace this recent history between yourself and Tampa Bay and say, okay, yeah, all right, fine, we lost to them, but guess what? This year's team is different. This year's team went out there and was better. And I think you can kind of lean out and say, okay, you know what? We know what's happened before. Guess what? It's our time now. We're going to be able to go out there, and little brother's going to have its comeuppance. And I liked hearing Brandon Montour say what he said, because it wasn't bulletin board material. It was, man, we're excited. We've been looking forward to this.
They should be.
So it's not, oh no, here we go again. It's, yeah, here we go again. It's our turn.
Yeah, and I think it's true. Look, I think getting the monkey off your back of winning that first series is huge, because now all of a sudden, you talked about it earlier, right? Like you haven't had experience until you get experience, right? And you haven't done this until you prove you can. Well, now the Panthers have proven they can win a series. So the whole talk of, hey, they haven't won a series since 1996 and they've only done it one season in their history, that conversation's over. They won a series. That's it. They won a series in which they fell behind and had to win 3 games in a row. They didn't have to. They could have gone to a Game 7, but they did win 3 games in a row, and they did it in dramatic fashion. And what was interesting is they did it more so with Carter Verhaeghe than they did. Barkov had a big goal in that Game 6, but Huberdeau and Barkov were fine. I mean, they're your stars. But to get Carter Verhaeghe playing the way he did, the kind of games that he had, finishing games the way he did, those 3 games in a row were huge. I mean, and again, it shows, we talk about the depth of the Heat, and it's always the parallel that we have with the Heat and Panthers this year. Both teams very deep. Both teams feel that depth will be big in the playoffs. And I think in that first series against Washington, it was huge. It will be that case again against Tampa. But when you look at the keys for the Panthers, I still think, there's 2 things, Clay, and I think the first one is obvious, is you can't fall behind 3-0 to the Lightning.
Yeah.
You got to stop doing that. I know it's exciting, and the comeback cats and the T-shirts and the fans, and we tweet about it. It's thrilling. But we really have reached the point now when you're facing Tampa in the playoffs where you cannot fall behind. I mean, I'll even say 2-0. I don't think you can fall behind 2-0, let alone 3-0, the way they have in these playoffs. They did against the Capitals, that wild comeback in, what was it, game 5. You just can't do that. So that's key 1. Key 2 is Bobrovsky and Vasilevsky, who's going to be the better goalie, and how do you figure that out? I think that's going to be obviously a big part of for the Panthers, and I guess it goes hand in hand. If you're playing well, not giving up 3 goals, chances are Bob's playing well, even though it's not always his fault. But I think finding a way to break through in Tampa early and getting those 1-0, 2-0 leads yourself is more so the key, because you can't be the comeback cats, in my opinion, not 4 times against a team like Tampa.
Well, yeah, and Vasilevsky is so good. The goaltending situation is so vastly different from what you saw against the Washington Capitals, and so that's why you can't fall behind, because it's not just is Tampa Bay the better team, but the goaltending situation is so far superior. So yes, that's obviously. And the other one, Will, and I think this is, you give them credit because they did it in the last series. You have to turn the page. Whether you win, whether you lose, you have to turn the page and move forward. And that's the one thing that I think sometimes happens with an inexperienced playoff team, is that you let one game linger a bit into the next. And whether it's you feel too good about yourself and you try to maybe you rest on what happened. Hey, well, it worked so well last time, let's do it again. And there's not that sense of urgency, of immediacy, of desperation. I think desperation is the right word. You heard Andrew Burnett say over and over again that the nerves got to them early in those games. You can't let that happen. I think maybe now you can kind of exhale a little bit and those nerves aren't there. That's a key. But more importantly, going back to what I just said, if you win game 1, don't let that be enough. Come back. If you lose game 1, don't let that weigh on you to where you lose 2 games and you go to Tampa down 0-2. You're going to lose a game or 2 in this series. Maybe it goes 7. I mean, so you can't let one game bleed into another, and that's kind of the thing that happens with these young teams. And I want to point out one guy that we talk about all the stars with this team. But midseason pickup, Claude Giroux. I mean, what would they? Where would they be?
What a smart move to get a guy like that. Yeah,
and that's what I'm talking about, the playoff experience and having somebody in that room who's been there and could say, okay, that's it, time to turn the page, time to move forward. And so it's not just his play on the ice, which obviously was fantastic in Game 6, but also having that mentality to let the guys know, all right, that was great, that was fun, let's move on.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
And I think part of it too is, again, between that, the veteran leadership, I think between the experience now that you can't go back to the whole, we've never done this before. I don't think nerves, I don't think that nervousness, energy, whatever you want to call it, and the thing that Burnett talked about a little bit when they fell behind 2-1 to Washington, is an acceptable answer anymore. This is the best team in the NHL during the season, and now you're facing the best team in the NHL the last 2 seasons with 2 championships. There can't be nerves. You've proven that you belong. You've proven you were the best team all year. You've proven that you can come back in a first round after a slow start. You've proven that you can make wild comebacks. Now you have to prove that you can beat this team in a 7-game series. So let's get to our predictions, Clay. I'm going to steal from the Heat page. I'm not going to say in 5, but I'm going to say Panthers in 7. I think if you really, look, if I take off my I want to see the Panthers advance hat off, I guess you could call it a homer. Fine, I'm a homer. I want to see the Panthers do well. I think Tampa probably, most people will say, has the edge just because based on experience in the 2 years and they've been there. And until the team proves that they could beat you in a series like this, you will usually side with a team that continues to do it. But I just feel this Panthers team, they got over the hump of the season of staying consistent. They got over the hump now of winning a series. I think it's time to get over the hump of Tampa. And between injuries with the Lightning, between the depth of the Panthers, between the excitement of the offense, I think the Panthers have enough to win in 7, and being at home ice certainly helps, but I really feel the Panthers are going to win this series.
Panthers in 5. And it's not
Panthers
a Heat in 5 thing. I believe in this
wow.
team. I think when they
I didn't
win
even know you were going to
against
say. I'm
Washington,
writing it in right now.
Panthers in
Clay
5.
says
Take a
Panthers in
screen grab.
5.
And I feel like what's going to happen, Will, is,
Put it in right
because
now.
it's Tampa and because, number one, the Panthers are used to playing them, they're not going to be surprised. I think there was a little bit, hey, Capitals are an 8 seed. I think there was a little bit of, oh man, hey, TJ Oshie, Alex Ovechkin, these guys can still really play.
I mean, that was a good team, by the way. That was not, Andrew Burnett was right.
No.
That was not a first round team. That was an impressive, you have a championship level team from, that has that experience.
It took them a while, and in games, it took them a while to find the desperation and the sense of urgency. I think because it's Tampa, and when the Panthers play like that, the best team in the league, and it's not close, I think Panthers in 5. And you know what? They may lose one of the first 2 games at home again. And by the way, I will say this: I'm not somebody that goes back and touts my own predictions.
Oh, you're going to tout this one. You're going to tout this one.
I said it. No, I said it before the series against Washington. I felt like they were going to lose one of the first 2 games at home, and it was going to end up being the best thing for them because they would learn, okay, you see your own blood, and you move on to the next game, and you find a way. I think with this, because it's Tampa Bay, I think everybody's looking at this the wrong way, that, oh, big brother again. I think it's the opposite. I think because it's Tampa Bay, they're going to play with that sense of urgency from the jump in every one of these games, and maybe you have
with that moment.
They win in 5.
I like the way you're thinking. And that will be one to tout. It's on video. We have it there. That is one to tout because that is something I don't think many will feel will happen. I think a lot of people feel this will be a 6 or 7 game series, me included, thinking 7. But hey, as long as the Panthers win, we continue to talk about the Cats and the Heat moving on the playoffs. We are very happy. So that's your Miami Sports Pod. Our Heat and Panthers profiles to their Heat Eastern Conference Finals against Boston. For the Panthers, their second round series against the Lightning. Clay and I will be covering both of those. We're back and forth. Let's go again for the craziest week of our careers. Let's do a round 2 with a lot of playoff stuff going on in town.